Hey guys, it's your host Julian. We're continuing the King of the Hill deep dive with storyboard artist Bill Riling. We chat about how Bill got onto King of the Hill, some of his favorite episodes, and what it was like working with some of the greatest writers and artists of all time. Before we roll into this week's episode, we got a little housekeeping to take care of. If you guys want to help support this show, follow the link below to our Patreon channel. We're offering early and ad-free access to all of our shows, as well as some other really cool things that are coming now and coming down the road as we grow into the Patreon space. As always, thank you guys so much for listening, watching, and supporting us. Now, on to the show. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Voice of My Head podcast. I'm your host, Julian, and today I'm joined by Bill. Bill, how are you, sir?
Fine, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. Big shout out to old Sean Cashman for setting this one up. I really appreciate it, Sean. I've had a lot of fun talking to the folks that Sean, he put a stamp out there, said, if you're going to talk King of the Hill, you got to talk to these guys. So what better way to talk King of the Hill with Bill here other than, man, what was that first day at Film Roman like, man? Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, well, I kind of got into animation through a side door. I was working on doing a comic strip for national syndication, and through that I ended up doing some gags for the Garfield comic strip. And then Film Roman animated Garfield and Friends, and I got a job cleaning up a board from Scott Shaw, comic book guy. And then after my first board, they hired me as a board artist. So that was my introduction into storyboarding, and it was a learn as you go experience. And then Phil Roman, he ran a studio, and he had a kind of like a policy where he tried to, as best as he could, roll you on to other projects. So I would do props for Bobby's World. I was an assistant on The Simpsons, and eventually, meeting other people. I met Clay Hall, and he was supervising director on The Simpsons. I got a test supervising director on King of the Hill, and I got a test to, board for the show, and that was my first go at it. In fact, I found my layout test in the garage after you called. Yeah, and it was kind of it's only a couple pages, but it was interesting. And it was just Peggy preparing her feet for I think it was when somebody had a foot fetish about Peggy's feet.
You want to show it?
Oh, I can show you. Well, this was I don't know if you can see that.
Oh yeah.
And then let's see. Yeah, like this was probably the first shot I did for. Let me see if I can get that. Can you see that?
Oh yeah, there you go. Right there, it's perfect.
Yeah, Peggy just setting up. She had boiled some rose petals, and she's going to sit down and, I guess, humidify her feet, and then like here she is just laying back, and then Hank comes in and says, "What are you doing, Peggy?" And it goes from there. So,
oh, that's great, man. What we'll do, if you can snap some pictures of it, what we'll do is we'll put it up on the throughout the video so people can see it. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're listening to this one, make sure you come out and check out the video portion of this so you can see these beautiful layouts that Bill here worked on. What was your when you're working or when you get that initial test mail? What was your initial thought of King of the Hill? Because this is was this before the pilot had dropped when you started doing your test?
No, this was after, and yeah, I thought it was a well written show.
Mhm.
Um, the I told you I had worked on The Simpsons as just doing assistant cleanup on the Simpsons boards, and those were the first scripts where I literally laughed out loud. I mean,
Yeah.
and then King of the Hill were the first scripts I read where not only did they have humor, but they also had a really nice emotional aspect to them.
Mhm.
So, um, I was definitely drawn to that.
Yeah, they straddled that line very well between humor and heart. I mean, this was the first show that I remember as a kid looking at it and going, "This is different." Like I told you before we hit record, I mean, King of the Hill and Hey Arnold, those two shows in particular, like Hey Arnold as a kid taught me how to be a really good person. And then King of the Hill, like that show developed my moral compass, like how I act as an adult now. Not so much, you know, Bobby or Hank, even though I felt like a Bobby when I was growing up. I was that chubby, awkward kid that tried to use humor as much as possible. I was definitely a weird kid, like most of us are growing up. Just trying to navigate your way through it, and then getting to see like everyday experiences or everyday problems, and these characters would work themselves through them in a very smart, articulate way, and they would do it with humor. And like I said, they always injected that heart throughout this entire episode or season series, whatever you want to call it. It was always there, man. So like I said, I absolutely love this show. So when you're starting to see, this board test, and you're starting to see this, wow, this is very smart. This is very heartfelt. This has got some substance to it. Um, how soon into your working do you start to get to, or who are you going to as far as after you get on the show? Who are some of your mentors, or who are some of the veteran artists that you're going to that are helping you through this process?
Well, Clay Hall was the supervising director, and I'd say he was the biggest influence on me. And then there was Alan Jacobson.
Hmm.
Um, I worked with other board artists. Oreste Canestrelli was actually a student of mine. I taught storyboarding, and he ended up as one of the premier board artists on
Hmm.
King of the Hill. And Whitney Martin, I shared a room with Whitney Martin.
Hmm.
And so, to answer your question, is I sought help wherever I could find it,
Yeah.
really. And it was that's the thing, was the people were just so great to work with. Everybody was very generous with their time or their thoughts, and not just that, but you also, for each episode, you had a director overseeing
Hmm.
you and guiding you, you know, and you go back and you look at the scripts were tight. Greg Daniels oversaw, that aspect of it. So it was a pretty tight run operation, So,
Now we'll get into those episodes that you had emailed me earlier, but do you remember the first episode you worked on?
oh boy, do I remember the first? No, I don't think I remember the first episode. I remember bits and pieces. Well, it's been 23 years, I think,
Yeah.
and I don't remember where I left my car keys. But the uh, the one I told you about was oh yeah, one that stands out is I worked for Trisha Garcia was the director, and it was called Oh Yeah, and it
Yeah.
had Snoop Dogg was
Hmm.
a character in that, and they take in a lady of the evening as a house guest, I guess, and Hank becomes a pimp daddy.
Yes, he
that,
does.
that was pretty good. And what I remember about that is when I worked as a storyboard artist, there was first of all, the time frame was very tight.
Hmm.
I may be off on this, but I think we had like a week to do thumbnails, maybe a little bit longer, and just a couple weeks to clean up. And I did very tight thumbnails, but the way I work is uh, for me, every board is like starting storyboarding over again. I
Hmm.
mean, you look at the blank page and I ask myself, how the hell am I going to get through this? But what happens for myself is reading the script, I'll get an idea for one shot. I
Hmm.
know I want to put this shot into the film. And doesn't mean it's a great shot. It
Yeah.
means it's, for me, it's like a starting point. And I can work backwards and forwards from that shot. Like, how do I get to it and where
Hmm.
do I go from it? And so the one shot I had was the prostitute character, forget her name, but had taken um, Peggy shopping at the mall,
Yeah.
and I just knew I wanted to do a shot where they're coming up the elevator and you just see them rising up into the scene and going to the store, and that was probably the initial drawing I did. And then, like I said, I worked backwards and forwards from that. But everybody's different. Every story artist works differently. But for me, that's usually what happens. I'll get an establishing shot and try to set it up from there.
Now, when you guys are handed episodes, I've heard it done. Obviously, animation is just so different across the board. Huge collaboration, but everybody's got their own style. Everybody's got their own flair. A lot of things I've heard is like they'll pair like action guys with action guys and funny guys with funny guys. Did they do that in King of the Hill as well?
Yes, actually, to a degree.
Hmm.
Um, like, I was definitely not one of the action guys where somebody like Oreste Canestrelli would fit that bill. And most of the artists could handle the type of action that was done in those scripts. But yeah, they would cast accordingly. That was the director's choice, and uh, so I might get the scene where, for instance, in the Oh Yeah episode, I would get the scenes dealing with the intimacy between Peggy and the prostitute
Hmm.
character, and somebody else might get the car chase sequence.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing.
Yeah. The only reason I asked that one is because seeing how you guys are divvied up, and obviously I've heard so much, from at least from the behind the scenes for King of the Hill, that the scripts were always really tight. You guys obviously were on an even tighter deadline to, you said, a week to thumbnail, and then a week after that one to.
Yeah, it could have been a little longer, but let me put it this way: there's two things I remember about the that it was the pain from the pressure, of getting it done,
Yeah.
but and then the people. So you had a
Mhm.
little bit of the bad, but you had the good of the people giving you the support.
And that
So
always makes it that much more special, man. Yeah, I've said it, and this is not me advocating for less money in my job, because boy, oh boy, do they get me 110% of the time. But I've always said it, man. It was not always, because when I was younger, I always thought you got to chase the bigger payday. When it came down to it, man, now I want to work with great people. I still want to make decent money, but the people make it worth staying, because if the people suck and the money's good, every day sucks at work, man. So hearing that King of the Hill was so tight knit, and you can kind of see it. I've always said it, man. You can really see when people are having fun at what they do, because it translates in the art. Whatever it is you do. I mean, I work in the food industry, so when people are having fun, the food
yeah.
tastes better, the food looks better, everything is that much better. It's the same thing with you guys' art.
Well, it's even integral to when you're casting for a feature film or anything that you have a team that can work together, and
Hmm.
that's a big part of, or that helps make the project go at least a little bit smoother. You
Yeah.
know.
Oh, I can't imagine, man. But sticking on Ho Yeah for a little while, because I just rewatched this, and I think that for the life of me, I want to say her name was Tammy, but I feel like it's not Tammy, but I think it is Tammy. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're watching, let us know what the prostitute's name was, the lady of the evening. But watching this one as a kid and then hearing Snoop Dogg, because I was really deep. I still am. I love hip hop. I love all styles of music, but hip hop has a special place in my heart, and that '90s hip hop in particular. Alabaster was that pimp's name, man. And just seeing, seeing and hearing Snoop pop up, like, is that Snoop? I was like, oh shit, man, King of the Hill has got some clout. They got Snoop Dogg on here as a voiceover artist, man. Did you ever get to see any of the voice actors doing their thing? And did you get to see this one done?
No, I didn't get to
No.
see any voice actors. The most I got to see, there were the time Mike Judge came through to say
Hmm.
hi to everybody, and Greg Daniels came through to say hi to everyone. And then there was like, when you finish a board, it goes out to the writers and the directors, and the best thing was they would leave a note on the front of your board, like "great job" or
Hmm.
uh, "so well done," and those were always, it was like getting a gold star on
Yeah.
your home when you were a kid, kind of thing. And so that was like, the a big part of, not the incentive, but it was a good thing to look forward to. But some writers would actually give you a call and say, "Hey, I like what you did there," or something like that. And I forget. I know this sounds crazy. I forget who called me, but I did get a call, and oh yeah,
Hmm.
from uh, either the writers or maybe even Mike Judge. But it was, you think I'd remember that? But that was a big deal.
Yeah.
No, and there were board artists that got calls all the time. I wasn't one of them, but it was
Well, well, it's
it
it's
was
always nice when you're recognized, when somebody comes out, they go out of their way because they don't have to. I've worked at so many places where you're just a cog in the machine, man, and to hear that they had because it's a morale booster at the end of the day, man. These people are coming up to you, they already know you're working hard, and then you're making their job that much more fun and that much more easier, or that much easier. I don't know if I should put more in there. I failed English in high
much
school, Bill,
easier.
so yeah, there we go. We figured this one out, man. So like I said, it's always nice to hear that even behind the scenes, it felt like you guys were a family. Like I said, that's why you got so much of this heart injected into this show.
Yeah,
Um,
and just so you know, it wasn't just like, story. Well, even though like Story Guy Song and Story Guy, it was the whole process. Like there were layout guys like,
mhm.
Ian Wilcox, and
Rest in peace.
yes,
Yeah.
just a great guy. And and other, and the PAs and all the production people. It was just, um, everybody supported everybody. It was a good mix. And
Absolutely.
with the supervising and everything, the directions, the directors,
Mhm.
it was great.
That's good, man. And you brought him up, man. Obviously, he passed away a few years back, tragically. Do you have anytime somebody comes up that is no longer here? We've done it with so many people. Tuck Tucker, legendary board artist. We've done it with Christina Cavanaugh, legendary voice actress. Um, but anytime somebody that is no longer here that passes up that you might have gotten to work with, do you have any cool stories or interactions that you might have had with Ian or?
Oh, well, yeah. Uh, Ian never met a movie he couldn't criticize, but Ian was just such a. It's just so hard to describe. He's such a great guy. The way I describe him was, he had, he was just like such an innocent, guy.
Mhm.
He had no guile. There was no uh, agenda with Ian. What you saw was what you got. And so Ian, we didn't just, storyboard. There were guys like, for myself, we wanted to be writers, or we wanted to create our own projects, things like that. So Ian was working on scripts while he was doing layout, and we would read each other's material and then give feedback. And he just had a great sense of humor, and it was just like hanging around with a big kid, and he
Yeah.
he just made you feel younger. So I miss him a lot. I didn't see him a lot in the years. I saw him at my birthday. He came to my birthday, but uh but every time you talk to him, it's like you never you just saw each other yesterday. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? and that kind of friend. And those are the best kind of friends, where you just pick up right where you left off, and like time hasn't even passed. And Ian was one of those people.
Thank you for sharing that. Like I said, anytime we can, reminisce about the folks that had such a impact on not only your life, but a lot of our lives, man, we get to paint a different picture of that person and see, another layer of what Ian was, man. So thank you for sharing that. When I think of, like I said, when I think of Oh Yeah Man, I think of Snoop Dogg, but I think of Hank the Pimp. That hat was so slick. And then one of my favorite characters, obviously, with the revival coming up, it's going to be interesting to see if they touch this character at all, because he did pass away, like the season before the last season. Cotton Hill. One of my favorite, he's probably my favorite character throughout this entire series. I mean, I love to hate this guy. Getting to hear about World War II through Cotton Hill was a big reason why I'm such a huge World War II fan. Getting to even though, during this time, didn't have Google back then, so anything anybody spouted off, you would believe them. Like, oh shit, this guy really had his shins blown off. Oh shit, he's really got shin jelly. Oh shit, his knees are really attached to his feet. So you start hearing all this. Oh, he killed 50 Nazis. So you hear all of this shit, and I'm like, fuck, dude, I want to know more about this. So this led me to reading more and wanting to know more about World War II. But like I said, anytime Cotton Hill was on the screen, man, he was an instant scene stealer. But the whole interaction with him and Tammy the prostitute, I really hope her name is Tammy, but the prostitute was just him rattling off places that he had slept with the prostitute, man. That scene is my favorite scene in the entire episode. Did you ever get to work on any of the Cotton Hill scenes in this episode? Do you remember?
Not in this episode, but I did. I worked on scenes with Cotton in other episodes. I could say he was, different to draw. There was, that. But and I like the character too. I think my favorite character, if I was to put favorites, several but first was Dale.
Dale is great.
Just the fact that he's not just Dale Gribble, but he's also Rusty Shackelford. Yeah. And then Bill. What's not to like about Bill? And so, and I too, I'm a World War II buff, so I did appreciate that aspect of Cotton.
Yeah, those two characters in particular, Cotton and Dale. I think I told Alan Jacobson this when I had him on my podcast a few weeks ago, and I told him, like, dude, I used to play D&D with my friends, and we would play online because all of us live in different states, and then I would always roll a wizard, and then whenever it got really, really hairy, like really bad, like we were all it was going to be a TPK, which is total party kill, ladies and gentlemen, for you non-nerds out there. I would always, roll to reach into my robes and pull out pocket sand because of Dale Gribble's pocket sand, man. And my DM was always a dick. Shane, I love you, man, but you're a dick DM. He would tell me, well, you didn't pick up any sand when you were in the, what was it, the town or whatever it was. I'm like, dude, we're in a fucking beach or we're in a dungeon. You can't tell me that everything's concrete down here. You didn't see me pick up the sand, but I've had the sand in my pocket the entire time because that's what Rusty Shackelford would have done. That's what Dale Gribble would have done. It never really worked out for me. I never really got to throw pocket sand, but it was always the intent to throw pocket sand any chance I got, man. So Dale Gribble, fantastic character. Sticking on the characters for just a little bit, man. You said, Cotton, Dale, and Bill were some of your favorite characters to work with. What were some of the harder characters that you got to work with, man? Was there anybody that was really difficult to slip into?
It's well, I guess Peggy for me, only because I didn't always agree with her personality, but that was just me, I guess. But no, all the other characters were fine. Probably had a small crush on Luann.
Everybody does,
And I loved John Redcorn, and most of the characters were fun. I loved Boomhauer. his mumbling and everything, like I'm doing now.
Do
So
you know how that character came about?
I really don't. Just you got to figure writers, or Mike Judge must have known somebody like that in Texas,
Well,
back in the day.
I
You
think it's on so whenever I do a deep dive into a specific series or a specific studio or anything like that, I try to get as much information as I can. So documentaries, DVD behind the scenes, like any of those extras. And there's one on YouTube and it's like 20 minutes long, or it might have been a podcast. I can't remember because I literally just went down a rabbit hole. Anything that said Mike Judge, Greg Daniels, anything King of the Hill, I just downloaded on Spotify or watched on YouTube, and I just tried to get everything I could to just absorb as much as possible. So it was one of those two things. It was either a DVD behind the scenes thing or it was on a podcast. And during Beavis and Butthead, the first run, there was a guy that had called in that sounded exactly like Boomhauer, and he was just talking a mile a minute and saying like how bad. When I find the clip, I'll send it over to you so you can check it out. And it's just
Yeah,
him. It's like him 30 seconds talking how the guy was talking, and he was fixated. He said something about buttholes, and he was like, I wanted to put that into this character, and I had this idea for Boomhauer, the guy you don't understand anything he says. He eventually gets to a point that one word, but the 42 words he said before it made no sense. It had nothing to do with the plot. It had nothing to do with the story. And you just get to that dang old buttholes, man. So just hearing how that character kind of came to be and how, the voice came around and knowing Mike did it, I was just like, this is such a fascinating. He's a fun character too, man. When you look at Boomhauer, he's
yeah,
so
yeah,
fun to watch,
yeah, and a mysterious life too behind him.
Absolutely, man. He's definitely, if anybody was a secret agent,
Yeah,
007, it's Boomhauer for sure. He's working for the NSA. Um, some of those other episodes that you had wrote and said you remember these ones, man. Queasy Rider and Trouble with Gribbles, man. Which one do you want to talk about next?
well, I guess Trouble with Gribbles would be next, and I didn't write them.
That's a
I
good one.
storyboarded on them,
Storyboard,
but
excuse me. Yeah.
it's okay. Um, yeah, again, this is just getting back to what you were asking about, like how do you come up with, what when you're going to board a
Hmm.
how do you go about boarding the sequence? And Sean Cashman was the director on this one, and in the episode, I had the episode where Dale is going to take the witness stand
Oh,
and and
dude, great
and,
scene.
and cross-examine himself, and like I knew when I read the script, I knew instantly. I get two words popped in my head, and it was just Woody Allen. And
Yeah.
yeah, Woody Allen had that scene, and I think it was Played Again, Sam, or I may be wrong about the movie, where he does that. He cross-examines himself. So it was. I'm sure the writers kind of did a little homage to that. So but still, you have to keep that visually interesting. You know what I'm saying? So
Hmm.
you'll notice in the scene there's cutaways and up shots and down shots and different angles to handle the scene and to keep the humor going. And it was an incredibly funny written sequence. Uh, but some of the things I did that, and I won't say they weren't scripted, but like I have them like scale over the witness box and just drop down off scene, and then pop up, like
Yeah.
in time with the and you know that's pretty much where, like I said, I started boarding and
Hmm.
build out from it. And of course, I got a ton of direction on that from Sean, you know, where to put in some insert shots and uh, things like that. But it still cracks me up. And the dialogue is so good. Like, he pulls out the People magazine, and yeah, it's funny stuff. If people get a chance, go ahead and Google it and watch that scene. It's pretty funny.
That is like when I think of all Dale scenes, that one is up there. Obviously the gun club takeover with Dale, and he turns into a straight mercenary. That one's up there. I'd have to sit here and really think of like all the Dale-isms, because he's just like Cotton for me. It's so hard to pick one. Like one is one, and the other one is 1A. 1A, 1B type of thing. It's so hard, because there's so much complexity to both of those characters. And Dale, like I said, anytime he's on, I'm laughing. It doesn't matter how many times I've seen this episode. I'm so glad you brought up the cross-examination, because in my opinion, that's the best scene in the entire episode. I mean, I love how he's just getting points, because what's funny about this is I'm going to date myself here. My mom and my dad smoked cigarettes and shit, and they had the or my grandparents, excuse me, my grandpa in specific, he had the Marlboro points. So you would tear these things off, ladies and gentlemen, you would send them in from your cigarettes, and Marlboro would send you shit. And I remember the talking bass fish. I can't remember what they called the bass fish from Marlboro, but the Manitoba cigarettes. Yeah, something Billy Bass or some shit like that. It was something crazy. So seeing all of this like swag from Manitoba cigarettes from Dale Gribble, I was like, dude, I lived this life. I saw my grandpa in Marlboro hats and fucking sweaters like Dale was in. So I was just like, this is life imitating art, or art imitating life. Either way, it's a sad concept, but I thought it was hilarious because I got to see this in real life, and then I got to see it, animated. And then just the whole sequence with him being a dick, but he's trying to help his wife, get whatever it is she wants to. So you see this character that you think he's just full of government conspiracies. He's just full of this shady shit. And then you see him, he's like, no, in his own little twisted, weird mind, he's doing something that's going to help somebody else, So like I said, once again, that heart is injected into these characters.
Right. Yes. And that's what, like I said earlier, drew me to it. It was the fact that they had the humor in the heart, so it was, again, tip of the hat to the writers, and also obviously the story crew.
Yeah, man, you guys boarded the hell out of that scene, man. That scene, like I said, that scene is the best scene in that episode, man. That whole cross-examination, I've laughed so hard at that, no matter how many times it comes up. Him jumping over, and then I can't remember the actress's name, but he says her name, and then he's like horse face, and then goes to the next one.
Oh, yeah,
it's just him shitting on.
Face.
Yeah.
Who was it? I can't remember her name either.
She's one of the.
She was like one of the most beautiful people at the time,
Sex and the City, I think, is the show she was on. But yeah, it was just him, just like I said, and then as quick as it was after he proved his point, Manitoba just goes, all right, man, can we push this case to dismiss? Case dismissed, get the hell out of my courtroom. And I was like, yeah, this is fucking great, man. When you're doing something like that, are you getting, obviously you say you get a scene and then you either work, from that either forward or backwards in the series. Generally, how many of you guys storyboard artists are working on one episode? Did it differ?
We have used 3. 3. It's broken into 3 acts, and each story artist gets an act, usually around 11 pages, sometimes 12. Sometimes, sometimes you'll have an action sequence in your scene, and it'll mean a lot more work. So you might not get like 12 pages, you might get 10 because of the action scene or something like that, because it'll take longer to board. Or sometimes you get one guy will get more pages than the other, but usually it averages out, if I remember correctly, to about 11, 12 pages each or something like that. I could around that number. And again, it's cast, like give him the, this is a comedic scene, this is a action scene or whatever. It's not always cast, but
yeah,
there are times that they do cast it. I'd like this person to take this part, and that's at the director's discretion. So,
where do you think you excelled the most at?
Me? Well, I'll be honest with you. I'm more of a I see myself as more of a writer, artist than an artist writer. My start was in comic strips, and so I was always attracted to humor. So I see myself as a gag guy
Yeah.
mostly, like trying trying to punch up scenes, uh, with comedy. Also, I worked some time in feature, and I was always looking for the emotional touchstone. Like,
Yeah.
um, how can I, you know, what is this scene saying? Like, what is the concept behind the scene? How can I do it in a funny way? And then how can I do it in an emotional way? And if I can't do both, how can I do one or the other? That
Yeah.
kind of. So, but that was my strength. I'd say my weaknesses um, were in my, perspective and, those the drawing skills. But because I didn't go to art school,
Hmm.
and but um, one of the best things about working in my career was being surrounded with just the most incredible talent. And I've been influenced by there were people's storyboards I would take home and study, like
Hmm.
Hank Tucker when I worked on Spider-Man, and just just um, incredible board guy, David Silverman, like his Simpson boards. You know, he did that Land of Chocolate with Homer. That thing
Yeah.
was amazing. And uh, those are the kind of influences, and those are the things I would study. Plus, they handed out. They actually gave out like different kinds of material, saying, here's what we're looking for.
Hmm.
So that helped too.
Oh, I can imagine. Um, with before we get off of trouble, or actually no, I remember what the original point was to that one. Now, when you feel like you're either story writer story, uh, what's the difference for that? Obviously, you said you were coming from comic strips and shit, so if you could punch up a gag, it was more gag driven. But is there a distinction between just those two? Did you feel like you wanted to
Well,
write more?
yeah, yeah. The distinction is in animation is being cinematic and
Hmm.
very filmic.
Okay.
Where in the types of strips was doing, that wasn't as important. But and then as far as what's the difference in the thing about the comic strip for me was I was everything. I was the director, I was
Hmm.
the writer, so it was my little world that I could create, and
Yeah.
there was nothing more than that, nothing better than that. So that's
Hmm.
why I was drawn to it so much. Um, and with storyboarding, there's revisions, there's fixes, all those, all sorts of things, and and then there's rules you have to follow. You don't cross the line. Compositional rules.
Hmm.
You know, and also executing pans and things like that. So, um, but I'm not saying that I didn't enjoy that. I totally
Yeah.
loved. I loved every minute of it. So, except for the pressure, there was a lot. There was a lot of pressure, and I remember, or at least in my mind, I remember it was like I said, 20 years ago. But I remember early on in storyboarding, like you used to be able to draw a character and the background,
Hmm.
and you wouldn't have to draw the background in the next panel or the next panel or the next. You just write BGSA, background same as.
Hmm.
And then um, if I had a character and they were going to walk off stage, I didn't have to walk them off stage. I just had to draw an arrow and say zips off stage, and so the boarding was like a really quick process. And then things started getting, when they started doing animatics for different shows, um, more was requested. You had to see more of the final film in that
Mhm.
animatic form. And so more and more story artists became not just story artists, but they became layout character designers. Sometimes you had to design a character, and so it got more complex in my mind as time went on, and then uh, and the time seemed to shrink. And I used to remember there would be a time you get a script, you do the board, and there was like a day of decompression.
Mhm.
We like I just remember that day of like, oh, I turned it in, now I can catch my breath. And I remember there was no day of decompression on in television in the primetime stuff. I'd be finishing my board and I'd see a script thrown down on my desk next to me, the next script, and I'd look back and forth and go, "Oh my gosh," you know. So, so yeah, it was there was that kind of pressure, but you know, I survived it and was happy to do it, you know, and they paid you well, so.
Yeah. Do
Mhm.
you did you guys get to do any of the classic storyboard pitches for King of the Hill? And if so, do you remember any of them?
No, no, I didn't never had to stand up in front of anybody to
No.
pitch. I did that early on in feature before, you know, before they started they went to Zoom and all that other
Hmm.
stuff lately. But uh that was a whole art form in itself. You had to be able to act, and some people could do voices, and I wasn't one of those people, but I managed to get through that. I not to go off of King of the Hill, but I remember my very first pitch at DreamWorks to Jeffrey Katzenberg. He had a saying was, if you don't come in Saturday, don't bother coming in Sunday. Um, and it was my first pitch to him was on a Sunday, and I had come down with a flu or something, but I had a pitch to him, and I pitched to him, and it went well. I think I got like 3 or 4 panels turned over, you know,
Hmm.
like take these out, the rest of it can go, that kind of thing.
What movie was
So
it for?
back then, oh, we were doing. I left King of the Hill to go to Father of the Bride at,
Okay.
at, at DreamWorks. So yeah, Clay Hall, this storyboard supervisor, had left to go to DreamWorks, and
Hmm.
then later on down the line, I called and asked if there were any openings, and he uh, he brought me on to do storyboards on that, and
Did you
that
ever
eventually. Huh?
go ahead? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, and that eventually led me to getting into feature.